I never thought I'd be sharing this. It's not easy to talk about, especially when it's so raw, so real, and still so fresh in my mind. But I guess the world needs to know what happened. I've kept quiet for too long, trying to move past it, but what happened to my son, what they did to him, no one should ever go through. So here I am, telling you everything, even though part of me wishes I could just erase it from my memory and never think about it again. It all started on that warm spring morning, just like any other day. I was up early making my coffee, trying to find a moment of peace before my day began. My son, Ethan, was still asleep in his room, the gentle hum of his oxygen machine filling the silence. Ethan's had it tough since he was born. His condition isn't something anyone can see just by looking at him. But I know, every single day I'm reminded of the battles he faces. The things that most people take for granted. I don't talk about it much, but that's because it's exhausting. The constant worry, the doctor's visits, the reminders that any moment could be his last. The world doesn't always see that, and I suppose that's where I made my first mistake. I thought I could shield him from it. I thought we could live like a normal family, in peace with the neighborhood around us understanding. But I was wrong. The HOA had always been a bit of a nuisance. The rules, the constant surveillance, the judgment, it was a lot. But I never expected them to go this far. I mean, who would? No one in their right mind would think that a group of people could be so heartless, so cruel. But then again, I didn't know them like I thought I did. It was a Tuesday when the first incident happened. A woman from the HOA, Karen, yes, that's her real name, and trust me, it fits, had been circling our house for days. I'd noticed her, the way she looked at Ethan, the way her eyes narrowed every time he wheeled himself outside in his chair. We didn't live in a fancy neighborhood, but it was home, and we kept to ourselves for the most part. The people here were decent, or at least I thought they were. I should have known that something was wrong when Karen knocked on our door, clipboard in hand, that Tuesday morning. She didn't even introduce herself properly. She just barged right in like she owned the place. Her voice was sharp, almost mocking. "We've had complaints about your son's wheelchair ramp," she said, glancing at the ramp outside. "It's not up to code. You need to take it down." I felt the blood rush to my ears, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew right away this wasn't about a ramp. It wasn't about rules or regulations. It was about her need to exert control, to remind me who was in charge. She'd never once shown any compassion. No empathy for a mother doing everything she could for her son. It wasn't the first time I'd dealt with someone like her, but it was the first time it felt personal. "Karen," I said, keeping my voice steady, "this ramp is vital for my son's well-being. It's not going anywhere. If you have a problem with it, you take it up with the city council." She didn't like that. Her eyes flashed, and I could see the judgment behind them. "You should have known better," she said with a sneer. "This isn't a free-for-all. You'll comply, or I'll have no choice but to escalate this further." I don't know what came over me at that moment, but something snapped. Something inside me broke. I could feel my muscles tense, the old soldier in me waking up. The drill sergeant who had spent years teaching men and women to follow orders, to endure, to survive, was ready to come back out of retirement. I'd fought wars, I'd seen things no parent should ever have to see. But I never imagined I'd be fighting a battle like this. Not for my son, not in my own home. I stood my ground, but I didn't engage. I simply told her, "You'll hear from my lawyer if you escalate this. We're done here." Karen left, but I couldn't shake the feeling of her eyes on us, her judgment hanging in the air like a cloud. It wasn't over, I knew that. She wasn't the type to let things go. The next day, the call came. The HOA had sent a formal notice, demanding we remove the ramp or they'd take legal action. They were serious, they weren't playing around. That's when things took a darker turn. I had no idea just how far they'd go to make our lives miserable. No idea that Karen, this woman who was supposed to be a simple neighbor, an insignificant part of the world, was about to push us to the brink. But it wasn't until that Friday afternoon that things escalated beyond anything I could have imagined. I was out back, trying to get Ethan to enjoy the fresh air when Karen showed up again. This time, her eyes were colder, more calculating. I could feel something in the pit of my stomach, She wasn't just mad anymore, she was out for blood. You know, she said, crossing her arms, it's a shame that you think you can live above the rules. Your son doesn't belong here. Before I could react, Karen stepped toward Ethan's chair, shoving him in a way that made him lose his balance. I rushed to catch him, but not before she pushed harder, sending him crashing into the muddy river that ran behind our house. I couldn't breathe. For a second, the world spun. My son, my sweet boy, was soaked, struggling in the cold water. I heard him scream, a sound that cut through me like a knife. And then I saw it, the smug look on Karen's face as she turned, as if she'd won. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly understand, was who she was messing with. I wasn't just a parent. I wasn't just some guy who would roll over and take it. I was a drill sergeant. And when you push someone like me too far, you don't just get a fight. You get something far worse. The cold water splashed against Ethan, but I was already moving. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline flooding my veins. I reached out, pulling him from the river with everything I had. He was shaking, his face pale, lips trembling. The look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. He didn't understand why this was happening, but he felt it. He felt the humiliation, the danger. I could see it. The fear in his eyes that wasn't just from the cold, but from the realization that someone had tried to hurt him. Karen was still standing there, smug, arms crossed over her chest as though this was just another day in her perfect little world. "What's the matter?" she called out, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Too sensitive, huh?" I should have said something. I should have yelled, screamed, anything to make her understand how wrong she was, but I didn't. I was too focused on my son, making sure he was okay, making sure he wasn't too shaken to talk to me. "Ethan," I whispered, cradling him in my arms. His small hands clutched my shirt, and I could feel him trying to steady his breath. He had been through more in his short life than any kid should have to endure. And yet, here he was, fighting to stay strong, fighting to hold it together in front of me. I turned my gaze back to Karen, my teeth clenched. The anger was building inside me now, the soldier in me pushing through all the layers of calm I tried to maintain. My son was hurting, and it was all because of this woman. This Karen who thought she could take everything from us without understanding the kind of fight she was starting. "I'm going to make this right," I muttered under my breath, not to anyone in particular, but to myself. Karen didn't hear me. She didn't care. She just turned and walked away, as if she had won some victory. As if my son's safety didn't matter. As if everything we had built, the trust, the peace, the life we had fought for, was just another thing for her to destroy. I didn't let Ethan see how furious I was. He needed me calm. He needed me steady. I told him everything was going to be fine, that we'd get him dry and warm, that nothing else would happen. I made sure he knew he was safe, but deep inside I was seething. Once I got him inside, dried him off, and settled him on the couch with his favorite blanket, I realized something. Karen wasn't just a nuisance. She wasn't some random HOA enforcer playing by the rules. She was personal. She was making this personal, and it was something I wasn't going to allow. I'd been through enough in my life to know when someone had crossed a line. And Karen had just crossed it. Big time. It wasn't about the ramp anymore. It wasn't about her stupid rules. She had attacked my son. She had tried to break us. But here's the thing no one tells you about people like Karen. They don't know when to stop. They don't realize when they're in over their heads. They push and push, thinking they'll win, thinking they have all the power, but there's always a tipping point. And once you reach it, there's no turning back. I sat there watching Ethan's chest rise and fall with each breath. He was safe now, but I knew I wasn't. Not yet. Not until I made sure she understood just how wrong she was. The phone call came that night, just after I had finally gotten Ethan to sleep. It was the HOA again. They were escalating their demands. Now they wanted a fine for the damage to the property. They wanted us to pay for violating the community standards. They had no idea who they were dealing with, did they? I clenched the phone in my hand, my mind racing. I didn't care about their petty rules anymore. They had messed with the wrong person. I'd been trained for this. I had faced down threats more dangerous than Karen could ever dream of. But this time, it wasn't just about me. It was about protecting my son, and that's what I would do, no matter the cost. I couldn't let it go. Not now. Not after what they did to Ethan. I needed to make sure Karen understood that there were consequences for pushing a parent to the edge. I didn't know how far this would go, but I was prepared to take it as far as I needed to. The rage bubbling inside me wasn't going to disappear until I made sure Ethan was safe, until I took everything from Karen that she thought she could take from us. The next day, I took action. I called in favors, made some moves, and learned a lot more about the HOA than I had ever wanted to. Turns out Karen wasn't just some rogue member. She was connected. She had friends in high places in the community and beyond. But that was okay, because I knew how to fight dirty when I needed to. And that's when I realized I wasn't just dealing with a Karen. I was dealing with a system, a network of power-hungry individuals who thought they could control everything around them. And now they had made it personal. I had no choice but to dive deeper, to pull on every string, to expose every lie, every hidden agenda. I wasn't just fighting for a ramp or for some stupid fine. Number. This was about justice. This was about making sure no one ever tried to hurt my son again. I didn't waste any time. I knew the stakes had shifted. This was no longer just about a ramp or an HOA violation. This was about Ethan, about our family's safety and dignity. The more I dug into Karen's past, the more I realized how deep the corruption ran. She wasn't just the head of the HOA, she was involved in every shady deal, every underhanded move made in the neighborhood. And I wasn't going to let that slide. I started by speaking to the other neighbors, trying to get a sense of who might be willing to speak out. At first, everyone was too scared, too afraid to get involved. They didn't want to anger the HOA, didn't want to make themselves targets. I understood that fear. I had lived with it for a long time, following orders, never questioning, always keeping my head down. But this wasn't the military. This wasn't a battlefield where I could just follow commands and keep quiet. I spent the next few days piecing together information, connecting the dots. I was getting closer. It was only a matter of time before I found the right leverage. And I did. One afternoon, I went to the local library. It wasn't something I normally did, but I was determined. I'd heard whispers about Karen's involvement in a few legal disputes, something about shady business dealings with a local contractor, but it was all secondhand information. I needed the truth. I needed something solid. I dug through old files, public records, and court cases. Finally, I found what I was looking for. There it was, buried deep in the archives. An old lawsuit against Karen and the HOA. She had been involved in a huge cover-up regarding a faulty construction project in the neighborhood. The HOA had ignored safety regulations and tried to cover up the incident when several homes were damaged. But it wasn't just about the money or the property damage. It was about lives. People had been injured, and no one had ever taken responsibility. That was my golden ticket. I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I had everything I needed to bring her down, but I couldn't do it alone. I needed to hit her where it would hurt the most, her reputation, her power, her hold over the community. I returned home that evening, feeling a rush of determination. Ethan was sitting on the couch, playing a video game. He looked so normal, so happy in that moment, and it broke my heart. He didn't deserve any of this. No child should have to experience what he had, especially at the hands of someone like Karen. But I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I reached out to a few people I knew, journalists, lawyers, anyone who could help me expose her for what she really was. I made sure everything was documented, everything was in order. I wasn't taking any chances. Karen thought she was untouchable. She thought she had the system rigged in her favor. But I was going to make sure she knew what it felt like to be on the other side of power. A few days later, I got the call. It was from one of the journalists I had contacted. They had confirmed everything. They were running the story, and it was going to break soon. My heart pounded in my chest. This was it. But Karen wasn't going to let this go without a fight. I knew that. She wasn't the type to back down, especially when she thought she was losing control. That's when things took another unexpected turn. The very next day, Karen showed up at my door. She was more than angry now. She was desperate. Her face was red, her hands shaking as she slammed a letter onto the porch. I didn't even bother to open it right away. I already knew what it was, her last-ditch effort to silence me, to threaten me into submission. "I warned you," she hissed, her eyes wild. "You don't know who you're messing with. I'll destroy you. Your life, your family, it's all on the line now." I stood there, calm. It took everything I had to hold back the rage, but I knew it was better to stay in control. "You should have thought about that before you pushed my son into a river," I said, my voice cold. "You made it personal, Karen, and now the world is going to know who you really are." Her face twisted with disbelief, like she couldn't comprehend what I was saying. "You think you can just expose me and get away with it?" she spat. "I have the power. I always have." "I'm not afraid of you anymore," I replied, stepping forward. "Your power is gone." I could see the fear in her eyes then. It wasn't a look of confidence or control. It was the look of someone who realized they were about to lose everything. And that's when I knew. This fight wasn't over, but it was close. I wasn't the one who was going to lose this battle. The days that followed felt like a whirlwind. I kept waiting for Karen's retaliation, for her to do something even more extreme, but the silence was deafening. I was waiting for her next move, but there was nothing, no calls, no threats. It was as though the whole situation had gone cold. The tension was thick, the kind that hangs in the air when you know something big is about to happen, but you're not sure exactly when or how. Then, out of nowhere, I received an anonymous tip. The journalist I'd been working with called me up late one night, his voice urgent. "Listen to me, I've got something you need to see," he said. "I'm sending it over now, but it's huge. You need to act fast." I was already sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the empty mug in front of me. It was too late for this, but I couldn't turn away. This had been my life for the past few weeks, waiting for the truth to break, for the story to unfold. The email came through seconds later. Attached was a set of documents, photos, and recordings. Evidence that Karen and the HOA had been running a blackmail operation against the residents for years. They had used their position of power to extort money from vulnerable homeowners, threatening fines, foreclosures, and other bogus penalties unless people paid up. It wasn't just shady, it was criminal. But the worst part? Karen had been at the center of it all. She had orchestrated everything, using her position to intimidate and control anyone who dared to stand up to her. The more I read, the more my stomach turned. She had preyed on the elderly, the disabled, and anyone she thought she could push around, and now she had messed with the wrong family. I didn't waste time thinking about it. I called the lawyer, then the local news station. Within hours, everything I had was on its way to the right people. The truth was going to come out, and Karen wasn't going to be able to hide behind her power anymore. The next morning, the storm hit. News vans appeared outside the neighborhood, reporters standing at the ready. The phone rang nonstop with calls from lawyers, city officials, and even residents demanding answers. The story had gone viral. People were outraged, but what shocked me the most was how many people came forward with their own stories of how Karen had bullied them or taken advantage of them. They had been too scared to speak out, but now they were ready to fight back. I couldn't help but feel a rush of vindication. Karen's empire was crumbling piece by piece. She had thought she was untouchable, but now she was being dragged through the mud. People who had once been silent were now taking action, exposing her for who she truly was. That afternoon, Karen finally reached out to me. The message was simple, but I could hear the panic in her words. "I can fix this. We can make this go away. Just tell me what you want, and I'll make sure it's done." But I didn't want anything from her anymore. Not her apology, not her empty promises. She had crossed the line and there was no going back. The damage had been done, and no amount of manipulation was going to change that. "I want you to disappear," I told her over the phone. I want you to leave this town. I want you to get out and never come back. You've destroyed enough lives." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, but I could hear the sound of her breath, shaky and unsure. She knew. She knew it was over. There was nothing left for her here. The next few days were a blur. The legal teams were in full force, and the HOA board members were scrambling to save whatever credibility they had left. But Karen was nowhere to be found. Her house was empty. Her name had been scrubbed from every HOA document, and it was as if she had vanished into thin air. I didn't care where she went, as long as she was gone, and for a moment I felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't over yet. The legal battles would continue. The damage to the neighborhood would take time to heal, but the nightmare was finally ending. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe. I could look at Ethan without that constant, gnawing feeling in the back of my mind. He was safe. We were safe. But the relief was short-lived. The feeling of victory was bittersweet. The damage that Karen had done, the pain she had caused, wasn't going to disappear just because she was gone. People's lives had been upended, and there would be a long road ahead for them to rebuild. But for now, at least we had taken the first step in making sure that no one would have to face that kind of cruelty again. Ethan and I sat on the porch that evening, watching the sunset. The world had been dark for so long, but now it felt like the light was finally creeping back in. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we had won. And in that moment, that was enough. The days after Karen's disappearance were quiet, almost too quiet. The neighborhood was starting to return to normal, but the scars she had left behind lingered. People who had once been terrified of speaking out were now sharing their stories, and the anger in the community was palpable. The neighborhood wasn't the same anymore. What had happened could never be erased. I spent most of my time with Ethan, helping him regain a sense of peace after everything that had happened. He was a quiet kid, and after the incident with Karen, he had become even more withdrawn. But every night he would sit with me on the couch, and we would talk about anything but the chaos. We'd laugh at the small things, the little moments that still brought him joy. It wasn't easy for him to move on. It wasn't easy for me either. But we had to try. I knew the legal battles weren't over. The HOA still had a lot to answer for, and the damage they'd caused couldn't just be swept away. There were lawsuits, hearings, and an entire investigation into how deeply Karen's control had reached. The weight of it all was heavy, but there was a sense of hope now, something that hadn't been there before. It was one afternoon, a few weeks later, when I received a letter. It was from the HOA, a final notice, and for a moment my heart sank. I thought it was more of the same. A threat, another demand, another attempt to silence us. But when I opened it, the words inside were different. They were offering an apology. It wasn't much, it wasn't a grand gesture, and it wasn't going to undo the damage they'd done. But for the first time, the HOA was acknowledging their wrongdoing. They were offering to cover the legal fees for the residents affected, to make a public apology, and to restructure their entire board to ensure nothing like this would ever happen again. I stared at the letter for a long time, the weight of it settling in. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't justice in the way I had imagined, but it was a step in the right direction. The first small piece of closure that we had been fighting for. I didn't know what Karen was doing now. I didn't care to know. She had vanished from the spotlight, and that was how I wanted it to stay. What mattered was that the community was slowly starting to rebuild. People were beginning to trust again, to believe that they didn't have to live in fear. And for me, that was enough. Later that week, the local news ran a story about the entire ordeal, the corruption within the HOA, the abuse of power, and how it had finally been exposed. It was a bittersweet feeling watching the story unfold on TV. I had been a part of it, but there was no satisfaction in seeing Karen and the HOA brought to their knees. The only satisfaction I got was knowing that Ethan and I were finally free. The hardest part wasn't over yet. There were still days when Ethan would wake up in the middle of the night, crying, reliving the trauma of that day by the river. But I was there for him, every step of the way. We were going to heal together. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself hope. Hope that things could be better, that life could be different, and that Ethan would grow up in a world where people like Karen couldn't hurt him, couldn't hurt anyone, ever again. This journey wasn't just about exposing corruption or seeking revenge. It was about protecting my family. It was about making sure my son felt safe, even when the world seemed like it was filled with people who didn't care. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing. I would always fight for my son, no matter what. And that was a promise I would never break.